The rushing water came without warning. One moment, Abigail Morgan was hanging linens on the clothesline outside her modest home at the edge of Salina, Kansas. The next, she was swept away in a torrent of murky brown water that had burst through the riverbanks after 3 days of relentless rain. April 1871 had brought the worst flooding the area had seen in decades. And as Abigail fought against the powerful current, her lungs burning for air, she felt the last of her strength ebbing away with the realization that this might be her end. Abigail had lost everything in a matter of minutes: her home, the small plot of land she had tended so carefully after her father's passing just 6 months prior. And now, it seemed, her very life. At 22 years old, she wasn't ready for it all to end this way. But as the floodwaters carried her farther from anything familiar, her limbs grew heavier with each desperate stroke. Her consciousness was fading when strong arms suddenly encircled her waist, pulling her against a solid chest. Through water-blurred vision, she caught a glimpse of a weathered face beneath a sodden cowboy hat before she surrendered to the darkness. "Stay with me," a deep voice commanded, cutting through her fading awareness. "We're going to make it. We're not giving up now." That simple word, "we," was the last thing Abigail heard before the world went black. When she awakened, it was to the crackling sound of a fire and the sensation of rough woolen blankets against her skin. For a moment, panic seized her as she realized she was wearing unfamiliar clothing, a man's shirt that hung loose on her smaller frame and trousers rolled several times at the ankles and cinched tight with a piece of rope. Her own dress was nowhere to be seen. "You're awake," the same deep voice from the river observed, and Abigail turned her head to see a tall figure silhouetted against the firelight. As he stepped closer, she could make out his features more clearly: a strong jaw darkened with stubble, eyes the color of a summer sky, and hair the shade of wheat fields in August. "Where am I?" she managed to ask, her throat raw from swallowing river water. "My hunting cabin," he answered, kneeling beside her and offering a tin cup of water. "About 3 miles upstream from where I found you. Name's Henry Frost. Most folks call me Hank." Abigail's hands trembled as she accepted the cup. "Abigail Morgan." "Did you?" She glanced down at her changed clothing, heat rising to her cheeks despite her exhaustion. "I had my back turned the whole time," Henry assured her quickly, the faintest hint of color appearing on his tanned face. "But your dress was soaked through, and hypothermia's a quick killer." "I apologize for the impropriety, but I wasn't about to let you die after managing to fish you out of that river." Abigail nodded, accepting his explanation. What choice did she have? Besides, she believed him. There was something honest in those blue eyes that spoke of integrity. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving my life." Henry nodded once, a brief acknowledgement. Anyone would have done the same, but they both knew that wasn't true. In these parts, many would have ridden past, unwilling to risk themselves against the raging waters for a stranger. "The flood," Abigail said suddenly, memories crashing back. "My home, it's gone, isn't it?" Henry's silence was answer enough. He settled onto a rough-hewn chair across from her makeshift bed. "I rode down that way after getting you settled. The whole riverbank's washed out for nearly a mile." "If you lived near the East Bend." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Tears filled Abigail's eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't rebuild her home or restore her father's land. "You got family nearby, someone I can take you to when you're stronger?" Henry asked. Abigail shook her head. "No one. My father passed last fall. Mother's been gone since I was 12. No siblings." She tried to keep her voice steady despite the overwhelming sense of loss. "I suppose I've lost everything now." Henry was quiet for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his thoughtful face. "Not everything," he finally said. "You're alive. Where there's life, there's hope." It was a simple platitude, one Abigail had heard countless times before, but something in his voice made the words feel like more than empty comfort. "Rest now," he told her, rising from his chair. "We'll figure out what comes next in the morning, that we again." Abigail wondered if he even realized he was speaking as though her troubles were now somehow shared between them. She ought to correct him, to make it clear that she wasn't his responsibility, but exhaustion was pulling her back toward sleep, and she surrendered to it gratefully. When morning came, Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Henry stood at a small cast iron stove, his back to her as he turned strips of meat in a skillet. The cabin, which she hadn't properly seen in the darkness, was modest but solid, a single room with the stone fireplace at one end, the cooking area at the other, and a table with 2 chairs between them. Her drying clothes hung from a line strung near the hearth. "Your dress should be dry enough to wear by midday," Henry said without turning around. "Thought you might be hungry." Abigail sat up slowly, testing her body's response. Every muscle ached, and bruises she hadn't noticed the night before made themselves known, but nothing seemed broken. "Thank you," she said, wrapping the blanket around herself before standing cautiously. "May I? Is there somewhere I might?" "Outhouse is out back," Henry replied, understanding her unspoken question. "Path's muddy but passable." "Take my boots by the door, they'll be too big, but better than nothing." When Abigail returned, face freshly splashed with cold water from the rain barrel outside, Henry had set 2 plates on the table. "Not fancy, but it'll keep you going," he said, gesturing to the simple breakfast of bacon, beans, and a thick slice of bread. Abigail sat across from him, suddenly aware of how inappropriate their situation was, an unmarried woman alone in a cabin with a man she'd just met. But conventional propriety seemed meaningless in the face of her current circumstances. "What will you do now?" Henry asked after they'd eaten in silence for a few minutes. Abigail set down her fork, the question bringing a fresh wave of uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "I had some money saved, but it was in a tin box under the floorboards in my house." "You could stay in Salina proper," Henry suggested. "Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house might take you in, maybe let you work for your room until you get on your feet. You know Mrs. Holloway?" Abigail asked, surprised. Henry nodded. "Known her since I was a boy. She's tough but fair." "And what about you?" Abigail found herself asking. "Do you live here?" Henry shook his head. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles north. Just use this cabin for hunting or when business keeps me away from home too long." He hesitated, then added, "I was on my way back from Wichita when the storm hit. Decided to wait it out here rather than risk the river crossing. Good thing, too, or I wouldn't have been around to fish you out." The way he said it, matter of fact, without seeking praise, made Abigail study him more carefully. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably no more than 30, with the weathered look that came from working outdoors. His hands were calloused, his forearms strong beneath rolled-up shirt sleeves, and despite his rough appearance, there was a gentleness to his movements that spoke of a man accustomed to caring for animals and respecting their strength. "I don't mean to be a burden," Abigail said, her pride asserting itself. "Once my clothes are dry, I can make my way to town." Henry looked out the window at the muddy landscape. The rain had finally stopped, but the aftermath was evident in the debris-strewn ground and waterlogged earth. "Roads'll be impassable for a couple of days yet," he said. "And you're still weak from yesterday. Makes more sense for you to stay here until things dry out a bit." Abigail wanted to protest, but she knew he was right. Her body ached, and the thought of trudging through miles of mud was daunting. "I have a mare tethered out back," Henry continued. "Once the ground's firmer, I'll take you into town. In the meantime, you can regain your strength." "That's very kind, but it's not kindness," Henry interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's common sense. And I've got plenty of work to keep me busy while we wait." There it was again, that "we." Abigail wondered if he even noticed he was doing it. The next 2 days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Henry spent most daylight hours outside, clearing debris from around the cabin, chopping firewood, or mending damage to the small stable where his horse was sheltered. Abigail, determined not to be useless, took over the indoor tasks, cooking simple meals from Henry's supplies, sweeping the packed earth floor and washing their few dishes in water he brought in from the rain barrel. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't awkward. In the evenings, Henry would clean his rifle or mend tack by the fire while Abigail used a needle and thread he'd produced from a saddlebag to repair the tears in her dress. Her father had taught her to be practical, and she'd added extra stitches where the fabric had weakened, knowing she'd need the garment to last. On the third morning, Abigail woke to find Henry already outside, saddling 2 horses, his own chestnut mare and a sturdy-looking bay. "Neighbor down the way lent me his gelding," Henry explained when she stepped outside, now dressed in her own clothes again. "Thought you might prefer your own mount for the ride to town." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Abigail. Most men would have expected her to ride behind them, but Henry had considered her comfort and dignity. "Thank you," she said, approaching the bay cautiously. "It's been a while since I've ridden, but my father made sure I knew how." Henry nodded approvingly. "This one's gentle, named Samson. Just give him a firm hand, and he'll treat you right." The journey to Salina took nearly 3 hours as they picked their way around washed-out sections of the trail. Henry pointed out landmarks as they rode, telling her about the area with the easy manner of someone who'd grown up in these parts. Abigail found herself relaxing in his company, occasionally sharing stories of her own childhood further east in Missouri, where her father had worked as a blacksmith before seeking better opportunities in Kansas. "My mother died of fever when I was young," she told him as they paused to rest the horses. "Father never remarried, said no one could replace her. He taught me everything he thought a woman should know, plus a fair bit that most think a woman shouldn't." Henry smiled at that. "Like what?" "Like how to shoot straight, mend a fence, and tell when someone's trying to cheat you on a horse trade," Abigail replied, returning his smile. "He said the West was no place for a helpless woman." "Sounds like a wise man," Henry commented. "Why'd you stay after he passed?" "Most women would have gone back east to family." Abigail's smile faded slightly. "The land was all we had. Father put everything into those 20 acres. I couldn't just abandon it." Her voice caught as she added, "Though I suppose it's gone now anyway." Henry was quiet for a moment, then said, "Land's still there, even if the house isn't. Soil might be better than ever after the flood settles. Rich silt gets deposited when rivers overflow." The thought hadn't occurred to Abigail. "You think I could rebuild?" Henry looked at her thoughtfully. "Takes money and labor to rebuild, but the land itself still has value." Before Abigail could respond, they crested a small rise and the town of Salina came into view. Though it was modest by Eastern standards, the collection of wooden buildings along a main street represented civilization and possibility. Abigail felt a surge of gratitude that she hadn't been carried farther downstream, away from the only place she knew in Kansas. They rode straight to the boarding house, a 2-story clapboard building with a small sign identifying it as Holloway House. Henry helped Abigail dismount, then tied both horses to the hitching post. "Mrs. Holloway can be particular," he warned as they approached the front door. "Let me do the talking at first." The woman who answered the door was tall and angular, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and spectacles perched on her nose. She looked first at Henry with recognition, then at Abigail with undisguised assessment. "Henry Frost," she said, her voice neither warm nor cold. "Wasn't expecting to see you in town this week." "Mrs. Holloway," Henry greeted her, removing his hat respectfully. "This is Miss Abigail Morgan. She lost her home in the flood, the Morgan place east of town. She's in need of lodging and perhaps work, if you've got either to offer." Mrs. Holloway's sharp eyes softened slightly as they took in Abigail's mended dress and determined expression. "Joshua Morgan's daughter, heard he passed this winter. Sorry for your loss." "Thank you, madam," Abigail replied. Mrs. Holloway pursed her lips, considering. "I do need help with the washing and mending. Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. My father always said I make a fine stew and passable bread." A hint of approval crossed the older woman's face. "Room and board in exchange for work, plus $2 a week. You'll share a room with my niece until you can afford better. No callers in your room, no staying out after dark, and Sunday mornings are for church, not sleep." "That's very generous, thank you," Abigail said, relief flooding through her. It wasn't much, but it was a start somewhere to stay while she figured out what to do about her father's land. Mrs. Holloway nodded once, then looked back at Henry. "And what's your part in this, Mr. Frost? Don't usually see you playing the Good Samaritan." If the question offended him, Henry didn't show it. Found Miss Morgan in the river during the worst of the flooding. My cabin was closest, so I took her there until the roads cleared enough to bring her to town. Something in Mrs. Holloway's expression suggested she was filing this information away for future consideration. Well, she said after a moment, she's here now and that's what matters. Come in, Miss Morgan, I'll show you where you'll be staying. Abigail turned to Henry, suddenly realizing this was goodbye. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. Henry shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. No need for thanks, just glad I was there. He hesitated, then added, I'll be in town every other Saturday for supplies. If you need anything, I'll be fine, Abigail assured him, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. Thank you, Mr. Frost, for everything. He nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and turned to leave. Abigail watched him mount his horse, raise a hand in farewell, and ride away, leading the borrowed bay behind him. Only then did she follow Mrs. Holloway into what would be her new home, at least for now. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and adjustment. Abigail rose before dawn each day to help prepare breakfast for the boarders, mostly single men who worked at the sawmill or the railroad that was being built nearby. After they left, she spent hours washing linens, scrubbing floors, and helping with the endless cooking and cleaning that kept Holloway House running. Mrs. Holloway was demanding but fair, and Abigail grew to respect the older woman's no-nonsense approach to life. Her niece, Clara, a quiet girl of 18 who helped with the lighter housework, became Abigail's friend, sharing the small attic room where they both slept on narrow cots. Uncle Henry came by asking after you, Clara mentioned one evening as they prepared for bed, about 3 weeks after Abigail's arrival. Uncle Henry? Abigail asked, confused. Mr. Frost, Clara clarified. He's not really my uncle, but I've known him since I was little. My mother and Aunt Margaret were friends with his mother before she died. Abigail tried to appear only mildly interested. Oh, what did he want? Clara shrugged. Just asked how you were settling in. He brought some of his honey. His bees make the best honey in the county. This was news to Abigail. He keeps bees. Has about 20 hives on his property, Clara said, brushing her hair. Started with just 2 after his father died, built it up over time, sells the honey and beeswax in town and as far as Wichita sometimes. Abigail found herself smiling at this new information. The image of the sturdy cowboy tending to beehives added an unexpected dimension to the man who had saved her life. 2 days later, Mrs. Holloway called Abigail into the kitchen and handed her a small glass jar filled with amber liquid. Mr. Frost left this for you, she said, one eyebrow raised in a question she didn't voice. Thank you, Abigail replied, accepting the jar of honey with a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. She found a small note tucked under the cloth covering the jar. Thought you might like a taste of sweetness after all the bitterness life served you lately. H.F. The simple gesture touched Abigail deeply. That night, she spread a little of the honey on a piece of bread and savored the rich flavor, thinking of the man who had pulled her from the floodwaters and spoken that simple, powerful we. When she had felt most alone, true to his word, Henry appeared in town the following Saturday. Abigail was hanging sheets on the line behind the boarding house when she heard the now familiar voice greeting Mrs. Holloway at the back door. Her heart quickened as she smoothed her apron and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear before walking toward the house. Henry stood just outside the kitchen door, hat in hand, looking simultaneously at ease and slightly out of place in town. His eyes lit up when he saw Abigail, though he kept his expression measured. "Miss Morgan," he greeted her. "Good to see you looking well." "Mr. Frost," she returned with a smile. "Thank you for the honey, it was very thoughtful." Mrs. Holloway watched their exchange with shrewd eyes before announcing, "I need potatoes from the cellar for supper." "Miss Morgan, perhaps you could show Mr. Frost where we keep the preserves he was asking about while I'm down there." It was a transparent excuse to give them a moment alone, and Abigail felt her cheeks warm as Mrs. Holloway disappeared down the cellar steps. "You're settling in all right?" Henry asked once they were alone. Yes, Mrs. Holloway has been very kind in her way, Abigail replied. The work is hard but honest, Henry nodded. Thought you might like to know I rode by your land yesterday. The waters receded completely now, your house. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The foundation's still there and a bit of the north wall, the rest was either washed away or isn't salvageable. Abigail had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still brought a wave of sadness. Thank you for checking, she said quietly. There's something else, Henry continued. Your father's shed, the one set further back from the river, it's still standing. Roof's damaged, but the structure's sound, and I found something you might want to see. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object and held it out to her. Abigail gasped when she recognized her mother's locket, a simple silver pendant her father had given her mother on their wedding day. It was hanging on a nail inside the shed, Henry explained. Thought it might be important to you? Abigail took the locket with trembling fingers. I thought it was lost forever, she whispered, opening it to reveal the tiny portraits of her parents inside. Father must have put it there after Mother died, I never knew. There are a few other things salvaged from the shed, Henry said, tools mainly and some crates. I've stored them at my place for safekeeping until you decide what you want to do with the land. The kindness of this gesture, riding to her property, checking the damage, saving what little remained of her past, moved Abigail deeply. Why are you doing all this for me? She asked, her voice soft with wonder. Henry looked uncomfortable with the question, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Seems like the right thing to do, he said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, I know what it's like to lose everything. My folks died of typhoid when I was 19, had to rebuild from almost nothing. Before Abigail could respond, Mrs. Holloway returned from the cellar and the moment of connection passed. Henry accepted a jar of pickled beans from Mrs. Holloway, made his farewells and was gone, leaving Abigail clutching her mother's locket and thinking about the land that still remained hers, even if the house was gone. That night, as she lay in her cot listening to Clara's soft breathing, Abigail made a decision. She would rebuild not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. Her father's land was her heritage and her future, and she wouldn't let it go without a fight. Over the next 2 months, Henry's visits to town became more frequent. Sometimes he would stop by the boarding house with small gifts, fresh eggs from his chickens, early summer berries picked from wild bushes on his property. Or once, a book of poetry he'd found at the general store that he thought she might enjoy. Each visit strengthened the connection between them, their conversations growing longer and more personal as they shared stories of their lives. Abigail learned that Henry had come to Kansas with his parents at 15, that he'd built his ranch from almost nothing after their deaths, and that despite his success, he still ate most meals alone in a house too big for one person. In turn, she told him about her dreams of having her own home again someday, her memories of her parents' loving partnership, and her determination to be self-sufficient despite the obstacles life had thrown in her path. Mrs. Holloway watched their growing friendship with knowing eyes, but said nothing beyond an occasional reminder about propriety. Clara was less restrained, teasing Abigail gently whenever Henry came to town. He never used to come to Salina this often before you arrived, she pointed out one evening as they prepared for bed. And he's never brought honey to anyone else at the boarding house. We're just friends, Abigail protested, though her flushed cheeks suggested her feelings might run deeper. Clara only smiled. If you say so. In late June, nearly 3 months after the flood, Henry arrived at the boarding house on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. He typically came on Saturdays. Abigail was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the next morning's bread, when Mrs. Holloway called her to the front parlor. Henry stood by the window, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He brightened when Abigail entered, though his expression remained serious. Miss Morgan, he greeted her. I hope I'm not interrupting your work. Not at all, she assured him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Is everything all right? Henry glanced at Mrs. Holloway, who took the hint and excused herself from the room, though Abigail had no doubt she would find a reason to pass by the partially open door frequently. "I've been thinking about your land," Henry said once they were alone. "And I have a business proposal," he clarified quickly, color rising in his face. Abigail's heart, which had leapt at the word proposal, steadied itself. "What kind of proposal?" Henry took a deep breath. "I'd like to help you rebuild your house, a small cabin to start with, something solid you could live in while you decide what to do next. In exchange, I'd like your permission to place some of my beehives on your land." Abigail blinked in surprise. "My land?" Henry nodded. "The wildflowers that grow along the riverbank on your property, they're perfect for honeybees, different from what grows near my place, would give the honey a unique flavor." He rushed on, as if afraid she might interrupt. "I'd build the cabin first, get you settled. The hives would come later, and I'd tend them myself, just visiting every week or so to check on them. You'd get a share of the honey, of course." The offer was unexpected but intriguing. "Why would you do this? Building a cabin is a lot of work, and lumber isn't cheap." Henry met her eyes directly. "I told you the honey from those wildflowers would be valuable, and—" He hesitated, then admitted, "I don't like thinking of you working yourself to exhaustion here when you have land of your own." There was something in his expression that suggested there might be more to his motivation than business sense, but Abigail didn't press him on it. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I can't accept charity, Mr. Frost." "It's not charity," he insisted. "It's an investment for both of us. You get a home, I get honey. Fair trade." Abigail considered the proposal. It would be months, perhaps years, before she saved enough to rebuild on her own. And the thought of having her independence again, of sleeping under her own roof on her own land, was powerfully tempting. "I would insist on helping with the construction," she said finally, "and I'd want everything in writing, a proper contract." A smile broke across Henry's face, transforming his usually serious expression. "Of course, we can have Mr. Peterson at the bank draw up the papers." "Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Frost," Abigail said, extending her hand to seal the agreement. Henry took it, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Henry," he corrected gently, "if we're to be business partners, perhaps you could call me Henry." "Henry," she repeated, smiling, "and you must call me Abigail." Their hands remained clasped a moment longer than necessary, and in that brief connection, Abigail felt something shift between them, a recognition of possibilities beyond their business arrangement. Mrs. Holloway chose that moment to return to the parlor, ending their private conversation, but the understanding that had passed between them lingered in Abigail's thoughts long after Henry had departed. True to his word, Henry began work on Abigail's cabin the following week. He arrived early on Monday morning with a wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies, accompanied by 2 ranch hands who would help with the heavier work. Abigail had arranged for the day off from the boarding house, eager to see her land again and to begin the process of reclaiming it. The sight of the flood's destruction was sobering. Where her childhood home had stood was now mostly bare earth, with only the stone foundation and a portion of one wall remaining. The surrounding land was littered with debris, branches, mud-caked household items, and unidentifiable bits of timber that might once have been furniture. But there was beauty too. The summer sun shone on fields now lush with new growth, and wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the riverbank, just as Henry had described. The shed, set on higher ground, stood sturdy despite its damaged roof, and the old oak tree that had shaded her father's favorite resting spot still spread its branches over the property. "It's still here," Abigail said softly, more to herself than to Henry, who stood beside her surveying the land. "Different, but still here," Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Land endures," he said simply. "Now, I thought we'd build the cabin there," he pointed to a spot about 50 yards from the river on a slight rise that would protect it from future flooding. "Good drainage, morning sun, afternoon shade from those cottonwoods." Abigail agreed with his assessment, and they set to work immediately, Henry and his men laying out the foundation while Abigail cleared debris from the area. By midday, the outline of what would be a modest one-room cabin was marked on the ground, and Henry's men had begun setting the cornerstone posts. They worked until sunset, and when it was time to leave, Abigail found herself reluctant to go. "I could stay," she suggested, looking at the beginnings of what would be her new home. "Sleep in the shed." Henry shook his head firmly. "Roof's not secure yet. One good rain and you'd be soaked. Besides," he added with a small smile, "Mrs. Holloway would have my hide if I let you stay out here unchaperoned." He was right, of course, though the reminder of propriety sent a flush of warmth to Abigail's cheeks. The world might see them as business partners, but the growing awareness between them whenever their eyes met suggested something deeper developing. The construction continued throughout the summer. Henry came with his men 3 days a week, and Abigail joined them whenever Mrs. Holloway could spare her. She learned to frame windows, to lay floorboards, and to shingle a roof under Henry's patient instruction. On days when she couldn't be there, he would stop by the boarding house in the evening to report on their progress. By August, the cabin was taking shape, a sturdy structure with 2 windows, a plank floor, and a stone fireplace that would provide warmth through the coming winter. It wasn't large or fancy, but watching it rise from the bare earth filled Abigail with a profound sense of accomplishment and hope. One particularly hot afternoon, as they worked side by side nailing the last of the exterior siding in place, Henry paused to wipe sweat from his brow. "Been thinking," he said, eyes on his work rather than on her. "That stove I've got in storage would fit nicely in here. Was my mother's, but I never use it at the ranch. Cast iron, good for cooking and heating both." Abigail stopped hammering. "I couldn't take your mother's stove, Henry," he shrugged, still not meeting her gaze. "Just sitting there collecting dust, shame for good iron to go unused." It was more than the offer of a stove, and they both knew it. It was Henry, piece by piece, investing himself in her future in this cabin that was becoming more than just a structure on her land. "Thank you," Abigail said softly. "I would be honored to use your mother's stove." Henry nodded once, a quick dip of his head, and returned to his hammering. But Abigail noticed the slight curve of his lips, the satisfied set of his shoulders. Something was building between them alongside the cabin, something neither had put into words, but that grew stronger with each passing day. By early September, the cabin was nearly complete. The roof was finished, the door hung properly on its hinges, the windows fitted with glass panes that Henry had special ordered from Wichita. Inside, the promised stove stood in one corner, its black iron surface gleaming after Henry had spent an entire afternoon cleaning and polishing it. A simple bed frame built by Henry occupied another corner, awaiting the mattress that Mrs. Holloway had helped Abigail stuff with clean straw and cotton batting. "Should be ready for you to move in next week," Henry said as they stood in the center of the cabin, surveying their work. His men had already departed for the day, leaving them alone as the afternoon sun slanted through the western window. "I can hardly believe it," Abigail replied, turning in a slow circle to take in the space that would soon be her home. "4 months ago, I thought I'd lost everything. Now you've got a new start," Henry finished for her, his voice warm with something more than simple satisfaction over a job well done. Abigail really looked at him, taking in the sun-browned face, the kind blue eyes, the strength in his shoulders that had carried lumber and lifted roof beams, all to help rebuild her life. In that moment, she realized how deeply her feelings for him had grown over the summer months. "We've got a new start," she corrected softly, echoing the "we" he had spoken when he pulled her from the flood waters. Henry's eyes widened slightly, and he took a step closer to her. "Abigail," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "There's something I've been wanting to say." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted whatever he had been about to confess. They both turned toward the door as a rider appeared in the yard, Clara from the boarding house, looking flushed and anxious. "Abigail," she called, dismounting quickly. "Mrs. Holloway sent me to find you. There's a man in town asking after you, says he's your cousin from back east." Abigail frowned in confusion. "Cousin? I don't have any cousins." Henry moved protectively to Abigail's side. "What's he look like, Clara?" "Tall, fancy clothes. Has a scar right here." Clara traced a line from her left temple to her cheek. "Says his name is Edward Morgan." Abigail gasped. Edward Morgan isn't my cousin. He's a man my father once caught trying to cheat him in a business deal back in Missouri. Father exposed him publicly, and Edward swore he'd make him pay someday. Henry's expression darkened. What's he doing in Salina? I don't know, Abigail said, a chill running through her despite the warm day. But it can't be good. He's asking all around town about you, Clara added. Mrs. Holloway didn't tell him anything, but Mr. Peterson at the bank mentioned you'd inherited your father's land. The man seemed very interested in that. Henry's jaw tightened. Sounds like he's after your property, Abigail. But why? It's just 20 acres with a half-built cabin, Abigail said, bewildered. Clara's eyes widened. You don't know. Mr. Peterson says the railroad's planning to run a spur line through this area next spring. They're buying up land all along the proposed route. Understanding dawned on Abigail. And my property would be directly in their path, she said slowly. Father always said our land would be valuable someday because of its location. He must have heard about the railroad plans. Henry was already moving toward the door. Clara, ride back and tell Mrs. Holloway we're coming. Abigail, stay close to me. If this Edward Morgan is who I think he is, he's got a reputation that extends beyond Missouri. You know of him? Abigail asked, hurrying to keep pace with Henry's long strides as they headed toward the horses. Heard of a man by that name in Wichita last year, con man who specializes in pressuring widows and single women out of their property, then selling it to the highest bidder. Usually moves on before the law catches up with him. The revelation sent another wave of apprehension through Abigail. What does he want with me? Henry helped her mount his mare, his hands lingering protectively at her waist. We're going to find out, and then we're going to make sure he understands that you're not alone anymore. The ride to town was tense and swift. By the time they reached Salina, the sun was setting, casting long shadows along the main street. Henry directed them straight to the sheriff's office, where they found a small crowd gathered outside. Sheriff Taylor, a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache, stood on the boardwalk addressing several townspeople, including Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Peterson from the bank. Now, folks, I understand your concerns, but unless he's broken a law here in Salina, there's not much I can do about a man's past in another state, the sheriff was saying as Henry helped Abigail dismount. He's a known confidence man, Sheriff, Mr. Peterson argued. And he's asking suspicious questions about Miss Morgan and her property. Henry stepped forward, his hand lightly touching the small of Abigail's back. Sheriff Taylor, he greeted the lawman. Where is this Edward Morgan now? The sheriff nodded a greeting to Henry. Mr. Frost. He's taken a room at the hotel, says he's just in town on family business, looking to help his cousin after hearing about her troubles. He's no relation to me, Abigail stated firmly, stepping forward. He's a man who once threatened my father and who has a reputation for swindling women out of their property. Sheriff Taylor studied her thoughtfully. That may be, Miss Morgan, but wanting to talk to you isn't a crime. Unless he threatens you directly or tries to forge documents, my hands are tied. So we just wait until he does something illegal? Henry asked, frustration evident in his voice. I'd advise Miss Morgan to be careful, not to sign anything, and to make sure she's not alone with him, the sheriff replied. Beyond that, the law requires evidence of wrongdoing, not just suspicion. Mrs. Holloway stepped forward, her thin face set with determination. She won't be alone. She'll stay at my boarding house with plenty of witnesses around. Henry nodded gratefully to the older woman, then turned back to the sheriff. I'd appreciate it if you'd keep an eye on him, all the same. Men like that don't usually give up easily when there's money to be made. Sheriff Taylor agreed, and the crowd gradually dispersed. As darkness fell over Salina, Henry walked Abigail and Mrs. Holloway back to the boarding house, his expression troubled. I don't like this, he said quietly to Abigail as they reached the front porch. The timing is too convenient, showing up just as your cabin is nearly finished, just before the railroad's plans become public knowledge. What can he possibly hope to accomplish? Abigail wondered. I would never sell to him, especially knowing who he is. Men like that have ways of applying pressure, Henry replied grimly. Be careful, Abigail, don't go anywhere alone until we see what he's after. The concern in his voice warmed her despite the worrying circumstances. I will, she promised. Then impulsively she reached out and squeezed his hand. Thank you, Henry, for everything. His fingers tightened around hers briefly before he released her hand. Get some rest, I'll be back in the morning. True to his word, Henry returned at first light, just as Abigail was helping to serve breakfast to the boarders. He declined Mrs. Holloway's offer of coffee, his expression serious as he drew Abigail aside. Edward Morgan was asking questions at the saloon last night about your father's death and whether there was an investigation, he reported in a low voice. Abigail frowned. An investigation? Father died of pneumonia. Everyone knows that, exactly. Which is why I don't like the direction of his questions. Henry ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Abigail had come to recognize as a sign of his concern. I think he's laying groundwork for something. Before they could discuss it further, the boarding house door opened, and a tall man in an expensive-looking suit entered. His dark hair was pomaded back from a high forehead, and a thin scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, just as Clara had described. His smile, directed at Abigail, didn't reach his cold eyes. Ah, Miss Morgan, I presume, he said, removing his hat with a flourish. Edward Morgan, I've been so looking forward to meeting you. Henry stepped slightly in front of Abigail, his posture protective. Edward's gaze flicked to him, assessing and dismissive in the same glance. And you are? Edward asked, his tone suggesting Henry's answer would be of little interest to him. Henry Frost, Henry replied evenly. Miss Morgan's business partner, something calculating flickered in Edward's eyes. Business partner? How interesting. I wasn't aware my dear cousin was engaged in commerce. We're not cousins, Mr. Morgan, Abigail said firmly, stepping around Henry to face the newcomer directly. And I would appreciate it if you would stop claiming a relationship that doesn't exist. Edward's smile didn't waver. A simple misunderstanding, perhaps, but we do share a connection. Your father and I had dealings in the past. Yes, when you tried to swindle him and he exposed you publicly, Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the anger she felt. I remember the incident quite clearly, Mr. Morgan. A flash of irritation crossed Edward's face before his smooth mask returned. Ancient history, my dear, water under the bridge. I'm here now because I heard about your tragic circumstances and thought I might offer assistance. Miss Morgan has all the assistance she needs, Henry interjected, his voice hard. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. I see. Well, regardless, I have a business proposition that might interest you, Miss Morgan. Perhaps we could discuss it privately. Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Mr. Frost, Abigail replied coolly. Mrs. Holloway, who had been hovering nearby, added, and me as the proprietor of this establishment. Edward's smile grew strained. Very well. I represent a group of investors interested in purchasing land in this area for development. We're prepared to make a generous offer for your father's property, say, $500. Quite a sum for land that's been partially destroyed by flooding, wouldn't you agree? $500 was indeed a substantial amount, more than Abigail could hope to save in several years of work. But Henry had mentioned the railroad's interest, and if that was true, her land would be worth far more. My property isn't for sale, Mr. Morgan, Abigail stated firmly. Edward's pleasant facade slipped further. Miss Morgan, be reasonable. You're a woman alone with no family, trying to maintain property that's far too much for you to handle. $500 would allow you to start fresh somewhere more suitable. She said no, Henry cut in, his voice carrying a warning. And she's not alone. Edward's gaze shifted between them and a knowing smirk appeared on his lips. I see. Well, Miss Morgan, when you tire of playing pioneer with your business partner, my offer will remain open for a limited time. He placed his hat back on his head. Do consider it carefully. Life can be unpredictable, and opportunities like this don't come along every day. The thinly veiled threat in his words wasn't lost on any of them. As Edward turned to leave, he paused at the door. Oh, and Miss Morgan. Do give my regards to Sheriff Taylor, such a thorough lawman. We had quite an interesting conversation about your father's passing. Such a tragedy, pneumonia taking a man in his prime, unless, of course, it wasn't pneumonia at all." With that parting shot, he departed, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. "What did he mean by that?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's expression was grim. "He's implying your father's death wasn't natural. It's a common tactic: create doubt, suggest wrongdoing, then use the threat of scandal or investigation to pressure someone into selling." Mrs. Holloway sniffed indignantly. "Despicable. Everyone knows Joshua Morgan died of pneumonia. Dr. Wilson attended him right until the end." "Morgan's counting on creating enough doubt to make Abigail uncomfortable," Henry said, "especially if he can get others in town talking." "But why go to such lengths?" Abigail wondered. "Surely there's other land he could target." Henry and Mrs. Holloway exchanged a look. "The railroad, Mrs. Holloway said simply. "What about it?" Abigail asked. Henry sighed. "Your land is perfectly positioned for the planned spur line. If the railroad has to have it, which they'll pay 10 times what Morgan offered, maybe more. He knows that. He's trying to get it from you cheap, then sell high." The revelation of how valuable her property truly was left Abigail reeling. Her father had always said the land would provide for her future, but she'd never imagined it would become so sought after. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking between Henry and Mrs. Holloway. "We finish your cabin," Henry said decisively. "Get you established on your land as quickly as possible. Make it clear to everyone in town that you're not going anywhere and that you have support." He hesitated, then added, "And I think we should talk to Dr. Wilson about your father's last illness. Get something in writing if possible." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "I'll speak with the Ladies' Aid Society. Nothing travels faster in Salina than news shared at their meetings. By tomorrow, everyone will know that Edward Morgan is a confidence man with no relation to you." Abigail felt a wave of gratitude for these people who had become her allies and friends. "Thank you both," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Henry's hand found hers and squeezed gently. "We'll handle this together," he promised, and the echoed "we" reminded her once again of that moment in the floodwaters when he had first brought hope back into her life. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Henry and his men worked from dawn until dusk to complete the cabin, while Abigail divided her time between helping at the building site and fulfilling her duties at the boarding house. True to her word, Mrs. Holloway had spread the word about Edward Morgan's true nature, and Abigail found herself receiving supportive nods and offers of assistance from townspeople who had previously barely acknowledged her existence. Dr. Wilson, a kindly older man who had treated her father, readily provided a detailed letter confirming that Joshua Morgan had died of pneumonia following a severe winter chill, and that he had been present throughout the illness and at the moment of death. The document was witnessed by both the sheriff and Mr. Peterson from the bank, creating an official record that would be difficult for Edward Morgan to challenge. Despite these precautions, Edward remained in town, occasionally appearing at the general store or the saloon, always with the same smug smile that suggested he had not given up on his plan. He made no further direct approaches to Abigail, but his presence was a constant reminder of the threat he posed. By the end of the week, the cabin was complete enough for habitation. The roof was secure, the windows and door fitted properly, the stove installed and tested. Henry had even built a simple table and 2 chairs, and Mrs. Holloway contributed curtains sewn from flour sacks to hang at the windows. On Saturday morning, Abigail packed her few belongings into a borrowed wagon, said a grateful farewell to Mrs. Holloway and Clara, and set out for her new home with Henry driving the team. The September day was bright and warm, the countryside lush after the summer rains, and despite the lingering worry about Edward Morgan, Abigail felt a surge of joy as they approached her land. "Home," she said softly as the cabin came into view, solid and welcoming in the morning light. Henry smiled at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Home," he agreed, bringing the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. They spent the day settling Abigail into her new dwelling. Henry showed her how to operate the damper on the stove, where he had stored extra firewood, and which of the cabin's beams would be best for hanging herbs and drying clothes. By late afternoon, the small space had begun to feel truly hers, with her mother's quilt on the bed, her father's Bible on the table, and the few household items she'd managed to salvage or acquire arranged neatly on shelves Henry had built along one wall. As sunset approached, Henry reluctantly prepared to leave. "I'd stay to make sure everything's secure," he said, "but propriety," Abigail finished for him with a small smile. "I understand. I'll be fine, Henry. You've made this place as safe as any home could be." He nodded, but concern lingered in his eyes. "I don't trust Morgan. Lock the door tonight and keep your father's rifle close just in case." "I will," she promised, touched by his protectiveness. Henry lingered in the doorway, looking as though there was more he wanted to say. Finally, he simply placed his hat on his head and said, "I'll stop by tomorrow after church to check on you, and next week we can start clearing ground for the beehives." Abigail nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Thank you, Henry, for everything." He held her gaze for a long moment, and Abigail thought he might step closer, might finally give voice to the feelings that had been growing between them all summer. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a gentle salute and turned to go. "Henry," she called after him impulsively. When he turned back, she said simply, "Be careful on the road." His smile warmed her more than the fire in the stove. "Always am. Good night, Abigail." After he left, Abigail moved around her new home, lighting the oil lamp as darkness fell, marveling at how quickly the small space had come to feel like hers. She prepared a simple supper of beans and bread, ate at her new table, and then readied herself for bed, following Henry's advice to lock the door and keep the rifle nearby. Despite the comfort of her own bed after months of sleeping on a narrow cot, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to Henry, to the unspoken words that hung between them, to the way his eyes softened when they looked at her, to the strength and gentleness of his hands as he helped build her new life. And beneath these thoughts ran a current of worry about Edward Morgan and what his next move might be. She must have fallen asleep eventually, for she woke suddenly in the darkest part of the night, unsure what had disturbed her. Then she heard it again, a soft scraping sound at her door. Instantly alert, Abigail reached for the rifle Henry had insisted she keep by her bed. The door handle turned slowly, testing the lock. Abigail's heart pounded as she quietly got out of bed, the rifle held steady in hands her father had taught to shoot straight. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice stronger than she felt. Silence answered her, then the sound of footsteps retreating quickly. Through the window, in the faint moonlight, she caught a glimpse of a tall figure hurrying away from the cabin. Though she couldn't see his face clearly, the expensive cut of his coat was unmistakably like the one Edward Morgan had worn in town. Abigail remained awake for the rest of the night, the rifle across her lap, jumping at every sound outside. When dawn finally broke, she was exhausted but determined not to let fear chase her from her home. After stoking the fire in the stove and making coffee, she stepped outside cautiously, surveying the area around her cabin. In the soft dirt near her door, she found footprints, a man's boots, larger than Henry's, with a distinctive pattern in the sole. More disturbing was what she found near her woodpile, several small piles of kindling and twigs arranged around the base of the cabin wall, as though someone had been preparing to start a fire. The implication was clear and terrifying. Edward Morgan hadn't just been trying to break in, he had been planning to burn her out, shaken but resolute. Abigail cleared away the evidence of the attempted arson, then set about her morning chores, constantly scanning her surroundings for any sign of Morgan's return. She was hanging her washing on the line when she heard the welcome sound of hoofbeats approaching. Henry appeared on the rise, his expression changing from pleasant anticipation to concern as he took in her pale face and the rifle she had kept close at hand, even while doing laundry. "What happened?" he asked as soon as he dismounted, striding quickly to her side. Abigail told him about the night visitor and the evidence she'd found in the morning. Henry's face darkened with anger as he examined the footprints by her door and the area near the woodpile where she'd found the kindling. "This ends now," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We're going to town to talk to Sheriff Taylor. Will he be able to do anything?" Abigail asked. "We have no proof it was Morgan." "Those boot prints are evidence," Henry pointed out, "and we know he's been asking about your land." It's enough for the sheriff to question him, at least. Reluctantly, Abigail agreed to return to town with Henry. After securing the cabin, they rode double on Henry's horse, Abigail acutely aware of his solid presence behind her, his arms reaching around her to hold the reins. They found Sheriff Taylor at his office, reviewing wanted posters with his deputy. The lawman listened gravely as they described the night's events and showed him a sketch Abigail had made of the boot print pattern. "I'll have a word with Mr. Morgan," the sheriff promised. "Can't arrest a man on a boot print alone, but I can let him know we're watching him closely." He gave Abigail a sympathetic look. "Might be safer if you stayed in town for a few days, Miss Morgan." "No," Abigail said firmly. "I won't be driven from my home." Henry cleared his throat. "I was thinking I might stay at Abigail's cabin for a few nights, sleep in the shed, keep watch. If you've no objection, Sheriff." Sheriff Taylor raised an eyebrow but nodded slowly. "That would be a sensible precaution. Miss Morgan's reputation would be safe enough with you in the shed rather than the cabin itself." The matter decided. They left the sheriff's office and were crossing the street to the general store to purchase supplies when they encountered Edward Morgan coming out of the hotel. His eyes narrowed when he saw them, and he made as if to turn away. "Morgan," Henry called out, his voice carrying the ring of authority that Abigail had heard him use with his ranch hands. Edward paused, then turned back with his practiced smile. "Mr. Frost, Miss Morgan, a pleasant surprise." "Cut the act," Henry said coldly. "We know you were at Abigail's cabin last night. We found your boot prints and the kindling you planned to use to burn her out." Edward's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "I was here at the hotel all night, as the clerk can confirm." "Hotel clerks can be bribed," Henry replied. "Sheriff Taylor will be questioning you shortly. I'd suggest you consider leaving Salina before things get uncomfortable for you." Edward's pleasant facade finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Miss Morgan," he said, ignoring Henry, "I don't think you understand the situation you're in. That land of yours is going to be mine one way or another. The smart play would be to take my offer and leave with your dignity and safety intact." "Are you threatening her?" Henry demanded, stepping closer to Edward. "Simply stating facts," Edward replied smoothly. "Things happen to isolated cabins, fires start, accidents occur. And sometimes young women who insist on living alone in the wilderness simply disappear." Before Abigail could react, Henry had grabbed Edward by the lapels of his expensive coat, slamming him against the hotel wall. "Henry," Abigail gasped, but her concern wasn't for Edward Morgan. "Listen carefully," Henry growled, his face inches from Edward's. "If anything at all happens to Abigail or her property, I will hold you personally responsible. And you don't want that, Morgan. Trust me on that." Edward's composure cracked at the raw threat in Henry's voice. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. "Unhand me," he demanded, trying to maintain his dignity. "This is assault. I could have you arrested." "Go ahead," Henry said, releasing him with a slight push. "Explain to Sheriff Taylor why you're making veiled threats against a respected member of this community." Edward straightened his coat, his eyes darting between Henry and Abigail. "This isn't over," he warned, but his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments before. "Yes, it is," Abigail said, finding her voice. "You will never have my land, Mr. Morgan. Never, so you might as well move on to your next scheme." Something in her tone, the absolute conviction behind her words, seemed to finally penetrate Edward's arrogance. He looked at her with new assessment, then at Henry, whose stance remained protective and unyielding. "We shall see," Edward said finally, but Abigail thought she detected a note of uncertainty in his voice as he turned and walked away. "I shouldn't have lost my temper," Henry said once Edward was out of earshot, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But when he threatened you, it's all right," Abigail assured him, placing a hand on his arm. "I think you may have finally gotten through to him." Henry covered her hand with his own. "Maybe, but I'm still staying at your place tonight." After purchasing the supplies they needed, they returned to Abigail's cabin, both on high alert for any sign of Edward or trouble. The rest of the day passed peacefully as they worked together to reinforce the shed where Henry would sleep, adding a sturdy new lock to its door and clearing the area around it for better visibility. As evening approached, Henry insisted on checking every corner of the property before retiring to the shed, his rifle within easy reach. Abigail watched from her doorway as he made his final rounds, struck by how natural it felt to have him there, protecting her home as if it were his own. "Good night, Henry," she called softly as he headed for the shed. "And thank you." He turned back, the fading light gilding his profile. "Sleep well, Abigail. I'll be close if you need me." That night, with Henry nearby, Abigail slept soundly for the first time since moving into her cabin. Morning came peacefully, the sun rising over the river in a blaze of gold and pink that promised a beautiful day. She was preparing breakfast when Henry knocked at her door, looking refreshed despite his night in the shed. "Any disturbances?" she asked, inviting him in for coffee. He shook his head. "Quiet as can be, but I'll stay again tonight just to be sure." They fell into an easy routine over the next few days. Henry would return to his ranch during daylight hours to tend to his affairs, then come back to Abigail's land by sunset to stand guard through the night. During the day, Abigail worked on making her cabin more homely, planting a small vegetable garden behind it and clearing more of the debris left by the flood. On the fourth day, Sheriff Taylor rode out to inform them that Edward Morgan had checked out of the hotel and boarded the eastbound train. "Doesn't mean he's gone for good," the sheriff cautioned, "but it's a start. I sent telegrams to the sheriffs in the next few towns along the line, asking them to keep an eye out for him." It was a relief, but not enough to convince Henry to abandon his protective vigil. "I'll stay a few more nights," he insisted, "just to be certain." Abigail didn't argue. The truth was, she had grown accustomed to his presence, to sharing coffee with him in the mornings, to knowing he was nearby as she fell asleep. It was a glimpse of what a shared life might be like, one that grew more appealing with each passing day. On the seventh night after Edward's departure from Salina, as Henry was preparing to head to the shed for the night, Abigail made a decision. Standing in her doorway, she said quietly, "It's getting colder at night. The shed can't be comfortable." Henry shrugged. "I've slept in worse places." "Still," Abigail continued, her heart racing, "it seems foolish for you to be uncomfortable when there's perfectly good floor space in here." She gestured to the cabin behind her. "I trust you, Henry, and I'd rest easier knowing you were warm." Henry's eyes widened slightly. "Abigail, your reputation is already the subject of town gossip, I'm sure," she finished for him. "What's one more night of talk? Besides, we both know you're a gentleman." He hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. Finally, he nodded. "I'll sleep by the door," he said, "and leave at first light." That night, Abigail lay in her bed while Henry settled onto a bedroll near the cabin door, a respectful distance between them. The arrangement was innocent, but there was an intimacy to sharing the small space that neither could deny. "Henry," Abigail said softly into the darkness, "what happens after this? After we're sure Morgan is gone for good?" There was a long pause before Henry replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "I start setting up the beehives, I suppose, as we agreed." "Is that all?" Abigail pressed gently. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken feelings. Finally, Henry sighed. "Abigail, when I pulled you from that river, I had no idea how much you would come to mean to me. These past months, watching you rebuild your life, seeing your strength and determination. I've never met anyone like you." Abigail's heart swelled at his words. "And I've never met anyone like you," she replied. "You gave me hope when I had none. You said we when I felt most alone." In the dim light from the banked fire, she saw Henry sit up, his silhouette strong against the faint glow. "I meant it then, and I mean it now," he said, his voice deeper with emotion. "But I don't want to take advantage of your gratitude or of this situation." "It's not gratitude I feel for you, Henry," Abigail said softly. Or at least, not only gratitude. The confession hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to put more definite words to the feelings that had been growing since that first day by the flood-swollen river. "We should get some sleep," Henry finally said, though his tone suggested sleep was the last thing on his mind. "We can talk more in the morning," but morning brought unexpected news. As they shared breakfast, a rider approached one of Henry's ranch hands, looking urgent. "Mr. Frost," the young man called as he dismounted, "you're needed back at the ranch right away. There's been trouble." Henry was on his feet immediately. "What kind of trouble, Jim?" "Fire in the north pasture last night," Jim reported grimly. "Got the livestock moved in time, but the old barn's gone. And Mr. Frost, it wasn't an accident. Sam found boot prints and evidence someone had deliberately set it." Abigail gasped, and Henry's expression hardened. "Morgan," he said flatly. Jim looked confused. "Don't know about that, sir, but there was something else. Found this nailed to a post near where the fire started." He handed Henry a folded piece of paper. Henry read it quickly, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" Abigail asked, moving to his side. He handed her the paper, which contained a simple message. "Stay out of my business, Frost. The lady's land will be mine. Next time it won't be an empty barn." "He's trying to scare you away from helping me," Abigail realized, horror and guilt washing over her. "Henry, I'm so sorry." "This is my fault." "No," Henry cut her off firmly. "This is Morgan's doing, not yours, and he's made a serious mistake. Threatening me directly changes things." Turning to Jim, he issued rapid instructions. "Ride to town, find Sheriff Taylor, tell him what's happened and show him this note. Tell him I said Morgan's escalating and we need to find him before someone gets hurt." As Jim rode off, Henry turned back to Abigail, his expression grim but determined. "I need to go assess the damage and make sure everyone at the ranch is safe. Will you be all right here alone?" Abigail wanted to insist on going with him, but she understood this was something he needed to handle. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I've got my father's rifle, and Morgan's focus seems to be on you now, not me." Henry hesitated, clearly torn between his responsibilities at the ranch and his desire to protect her. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised, already moving toward his horse. "Henry," Abigail called after him, "please be careful." He paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I will, and Abigail, we will finish that conversation." With that promise hanging between them, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Abigail standing in front of her cabin, worry and something like hope warring in her heart. The day passed slowly for Abigail as she waited for news. To keep her mind occupied, she threw herself into work around the cabin, tending her small garden, mending clothes, and preparing a stew that would be ready whenever Henry returned. As evening approached with no sign of him, her worry deepened. Just as the sun was setting, she heard hoofbeats approaching and hurried outside, relief flooding her at the sight of Henry riding toward the cabin. But her relief turned to concern when she saw the state he was in. His clothes were smudged with soot, and a bandage wrapped his left forearm. "Henry." She gasped, running to help him dismount. "You're hurt." "It's nothing serious," he assured her, though his wince as he swung down from the saddle suggested otherwise. "Just a burn from clearing debris. The barn was a total loss, but we saved the surrounding structures." Abigail led him into the cabin, insisting he sit while she examined his arm. "Any sign of Morgan?" she asked as she gently unwrapped the bandage. Henry shook his head. "No, but Sheriff Taylor's organized search parties. He's taking this seriously now that there's been actual destruction of property. They've sent telegrams all along the railroad line with Morgan's description." The burn on his arm was an angry red, but not as severe as Abigail had feared. She carefully cleaned it with water she'd boiled earlier, then applied a salve of honey and herbs she'd prepared that afternoon, anticipating he might need tending. "You were expecting me to be injured?" Henry asked with a faint smile as she wrapped a fresh bandage around his arm. "I was hoping you wouldn't be," Abigail corrected, "but I wanted to be prepared just in case." She completed the bandaging and sat back, studying his face. "You look exhausted. It's been a long day," he admitted. The men are on watch at the ranch tonight in case Morgan returns, but I needed to make sure you were safe. The simple admission, the fact that he'd come to her despite his exhaustion and injury, filled Abigail with warmth. I'm glad you came, she said softly. I was worried about you. Henry's eyes held hers for a long moment, and Abigail thought he might reach for her. Instead, he glanced at the stove where her stew simmered. Something smells good. Abigail smiled, accepting the temporary shift in conversation. Venison stew. I thought you might be hungry when you got back. They ate together at the small table Henry had built, the simple meal made richer by shared concern and growing feelings neither had fully expressed. As they finished, Henry finally broached the subject they'd left unresolved that morning. Abigail, he began, his voice serious, last night you asked what happens after Morgan is gone. I've been thinking about that all day. He took a deep breath, then continued. I know this isn't the most romantic timing with everything that's happening, but I don't want to wait any longer to tell you how I feel. Abigail's heart quickened as Henry reached across the table to take her hand in his. From the moment I pulled you from that river, something changed in me, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. At first I told myself I was just doing what anyone would do, helping someone in need, but it was more than that. There was a connection between us, something I can't fully explain, but that's grown stronger every day since. I felt it too, Abigail admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's fingers tightened around hers. When I said we that day, I didn't even realize I was saying it. It just came naturally, as if from that moment your struggles were mine too, and now I can't imagine my life without you in it. Tears blurred Abigail's vision as Henry continued, his voice growing more confident. I love you, Abigail Morgan. I love your strength, your determination, your kindness. I love the way you've faced every challenge without surrendering. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, facing whatever comes next together. The words Abigail had been longing to hear washed over her like a healing balm, erasing the fear and uncertainty of the past months. I love you too, Henry, she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. You brought hope back into my life when I thought all was lost. You've shown me what it means to have someone stand beside you through the worst times, not just the best. She squeezed his hand. Yes, I'll have you. There's nothing I want more than to face life with you. Henry's face lit with joy as he rose from his chair, drawing Abigail to her feet and into his arms. For a long moment, they simply held each other, savoring the certainty of their shared feelings. Then Henry tilted her face up to his and kissed her with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew he possessed. Abigail's arms wound around his neck as she returned his kiss, pouring months of growing love into the gesture. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. I should have done that weeks ago, he murmured. Abigail smiled. Better late than never. They spent the evening making plans for the immediate future and for the life they would build together. Henry would stay at the ranch until Morgan was found, ensuring his workers were safe. Abigail would remain at her cabin, but with additional protection, Henry planned to send one of his most trusted ranch hands to keep watch during the day, and he would come himself each evening. And once this business with Morgan is resolved, Abigail asked, nestled against Henry's side as they sat before the fire. Then, with your permission, I'll speak to Reverend Johnson about publishing the banns, Henry replied. Unless you'd prefer a longer courtship, Abigail shook her head. We've been courting since the day you pulled me from the river, she said with a smile. We just didn't call it that, Henry chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. True enough. Then, once we're married, we have a decision to make whether to live at the ranch or here. Could we do both? Abigail suggested. The ranch during the week and here on weekends. I can't bear to give up this land completely. It was my father's dream, and now it's become part of mine. Henry nodded thoughtfully. We could. The ranch house is large enough for a family, and this cabin could be our retreat. And I still plan to put those beehives along your riverbank. Our riverbank now, Abigail corrected him softly. Henry smiled, tightening his arm around her shoulders. Our riverbank, our cabin, our future. The possessive pronouns felt right. a natural evolution of the we that had given Abigail hope in her darkest moment. As the fire burned low, they continued to talk, making plans and sharing dreams, secure in their love despite the shadow Morgan still cast over their happiness. Morning came too soon, and with it, the necessity for Henry to return to his ranch. They parted with a lingering kiss and a promise to meet again that evening. As arranged, one of Henry's ranch hands arrived to keep watch over Abigail's property, settling himself in the shed with a book and a rifle, discreetly present but giving Abigail privacy to go about her day. The next week passed in a pattern of daytime separation and evening reunion. Each night, Henry would arrive at Abigail's cabin. They would share a meal and quiet conversation, and then he would retire to the shed, both of them agreeing that propriety should be maintained until their wedding. Each morning they parted with growing reluctance, counting the days until Morgan would be caught, and they could begin their life together properly. On the 8th day after Henry's proposal, Sheriff Taylor rode out to Abigail's cabin with news. Edward Morgan had been apprehended in Wichita, attempting to board a train for Denver. He was being held on charges of arson and attempted fraud, with additional charges pending from authorities in Missouri who had been searching for him in connection with similar schemes. He'll be facing a judge in Topeka next month, the sheriff informed them. Given his history and the evidence against him, he's looking at several years in prison. You two shouldn't have any more trouble from him. The relief Abigail felt was profound. That evening, as she and Henry sat together on the small bench he had built outside her cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, she felt truly at peace for the first time since the flood had swept away her old life. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "About how much has changed since April," she replied. "About how what seemed like the end of everything was actually just the beginning." Henry nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Life has a way of surprising us like that. One day you're riding home in a storm, the next you're pulling the woman you'll marry from a flooded river." Abigail smiled at his matter-of-fact description of their first meeting. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd taken a different route that day? If you hadn't been there when the flood came?" "No," Henry said simply. "Because I was there. Some things are meant to be, Abigail. I believe that now more than ever." She leaned into him, content with his answer. "So do I." The following Sunday, Reverend Johnson announced their engagement to the congregation of Selena's small church. There were a few raised eyebrows. Their courtship had been unconventional by anyone's standards, but far more smiles and congratulations. Mrs. Holloway looked particularly satisfied, as though she had predicted this outcome from the start. With Morgan no longer a threat, preparations for their wedding began in earnest. The ceremony was set for the first Saturday in November, giving them just over a month to prepare. Abigail, with help from Mrs. Holloway and Clara, began work on a wedding dress, while Henry focused on making improvements to both the ranch house and the cabin to prepare for their shared life. The property that had once represented Abigail's desperate struggle for survival now became a symbol of their future together. Henry kept his promise about the beehives, installing 5 of them along the riverbank where wildflowers grew in profusion. Together, they planted fruit trees that would take years to mature, a living testament to their commitment to building a life together on this land. As their wedding day approached, the railroad company made a formal offer for a small portion of Abigail's property, a strip along the eastern edge that they needed for their spur line. The offer was generous, far more than the $500 Morgan had proposed, and came with guarantees that the rest of the land would remain untouched. After careful consideration, Abigail and Henry accepted, using part of the money to complete improvements on both properties, and setting the rest aside for their future needs. On the evening before their wedding, Henry brought Abigail to the ranch house that would soon be their primary home. It was larger than she had imagined, a solidly built 2-story structure with a wide porch and rooms that spoke of Henry's years of hard work and careful planning. "It was too big for just me," Henry admitted as he showed her through the house. I built it thinking someday I might have a family, but as the years passed, I started to wonder if that would ever happen. Abigail squeezed his hand. It's perfect for us, she said, already envisioning the life they would build within these walls. In what would be their bedroom, Henry showed her a quilt top he had commissioned from the Ladies' Aid Society, featuring a pattern of honeybees and wildflowers. It's not quite finished, he said almost shyly. They promised it would be ready by Christmas. I wanted you to have something that represented both of us, my bees and your wildflowers. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Abigail's eyes. It's beautiful, Henry, I love it. Their wedding day dawned clear and cool, a perfect November morning. Abigail dressed in the simple but elegant gown she and Mrs. Holloway had created. Her mother's locket around her neck, containing now not only the portraits of her parents, but also a small photograph of Henry that a traveling photographer had taken in town the previous week. The ceremony was held in Selena's church, filled to capacity with townspeople and Henry's ranch hands. As Abigail walked down the aisle alone, a bittersweet reminder of her father's absence, her eyes found Henry waiting for her at the altar, his face alight with love and pride. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that the flood that had nearly claimed her life had instead delivered her to exactly where she was meant to be. Dearly beloved, Reverend Johnson began, but Abigail scarcely heard the familiar words, her attention fixed on Henry's face, on the promise in his eyes that echoed the one he had made when he first pulled her from the raging waters. We're going to make it. We're not giving up now. When they exchanged their vows, Henry's voice was steady and sure, while Abigail's trembled slightly with emotion. The simple gold bands they placed on each other's fingers represented not just their love, but the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment, from strangers thrown together by disaster to partners bound by choice and devotion. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Johnson declared, and as Henry's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, Abigail felt the last piece of her heart slot into place. The crowd's applause seemed distant, secondary to the profound connection she felt with the man who had become her husband. The celebration that followed at the Holloway house was joyful and boisterous, with music and dancing lasting well into the evening. As twilight fell, Henry and Abigail slipped away, bound for the ranch house where they would spend their first night as husband and wife. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Abigail nestled against Henry's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Happy? He asked softly, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. More than I ever thought possible, she replied truthfully. And you, Henry's arms tightened around her. I have everything I never knew I was looking for, he said. A wife I adore, land that sustains us, work that fulfills us both. What more could any man want? Perhaps someday children, Abigail suggested, her voice hesitant but hopeful. Henry's smile was evident in his voice. I was thinking the same thing. A boy with your determination, a girl with your eyes, or any combination that life sees fit to bless us with. The thought of children, their children, filled Abigail with a warm glow of anticipation. They'll grow up knowing both homes, she mused, learning about bees and wildflowers and horses. And floods, Henry added more seriously. They should know how we met, how close we came to never finding each other. Abigail nodded against his chest. We'll tell them everything, how you carried me from the water, how you said we when I had no hope left. How something beautiful grew from disaster. Our story, Henry agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair, the beginning of our family's history. As they drifted towards sleep in each other's arms, Abigail thought about the journey that had brought them here, how the worst day of her life had ultimately led to the greatest happiness she had ever known. The flood that had nearly ended her story had instead begun a new chapter, one filled with love and promise, and the strength that comes from facing life's challenges together. The years that followed proved the wisdom of their choices. The cabin on Abigail's land became their weekend retreat, a place where they could escape the demands of the ranch and enjoy the simpler pleasures of life together. Henry's beehives thrived along the riverbank, producing honey that became famous throughout the region for its distinctive flavor, while the ranch prospered under their joint management. Their first child, a son they named Joshua Henry after both their fathers, arrived a year after their wedding, a strong, healthy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Margaret Rose, who from her earliest days showed the same determination that had helped Abigail survive the flood. As the children grew, Henry and Abigail made sure they understood the importance of both properties that formed their heritage. They taught them how to tend the beehives, how to respect the river's power while appreciating its beauty, and how to recognize the wildflowers that made their honey special. Most importantly, they taught them the value of resilience, of finding hope even in the darkest moments, and of the strength that comes from facing challenges together. By the time their children were old enough to hear the full story of how their parents met, the cabin had been expanded into a comfortable family home, and the ranch had grown to include additional land acquired over the years. The railroad spur that Edward Morgan had schemed to profit from was now a convenient connection to markets for their honey and other products, a reminder that good could come even from others' ill intentions. On the 10th anniversary of the flood that had brought them together, Henry and Abigail stood on the riverbank near where he had pulled her from the water, their children playing nearby under the watchful eye of Clara, who had married one of Henry's ranch hands and remained a dear friend. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if the flood hadn't come?" Henry asked, his arm around Abigail's waist as they watched the now peaceful river flowing past. Abigail considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that the flood didn't just take away my old life, it carried me to you, and for that I can only be grateful." Henry smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with the expression that was still Abigail's favorite sight in the world. "From disaster to blessing," he murmured. "That's our story. That's our beginning," Abigail corrected gently, her hand resting on the slight swell of her stomach where their third child was growing. "The rest is still being written." As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in colors no artist could fully capture, Henry bent to kiss his wife, a gesture as familiar as breathing after 10 years of marriage, yet still filled with the wonder of that first kiss they had shared. Around them, the land that had witnessed their story continued its ancient rhythms, the river flowing, the wildflowers blooming, the bees gathering nectar to create something sweet and sustaining. And in that perfect moment, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that the flood that had nearly claimed her life had instead delivered her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the man who had carried her from the water and said "we" when she had no hope left, creating a life together that was richer and more beautiful than either could have imagined alone.